Is sa relic seo war crocáin láb le cahar na Gaillimhe atá crábha réalta mhór sport sínte. Tá taisí Tom Molineaux ina lí I gré na ciile seo le beagnach 8 bliain agus le himach na mblianta sin tá cuimhne a chud gasci imi le gaí. Ach mátá hain is iontach agus is epiciúil an scéal bhaineann leis. Fearach ach mhaid sláirí na sclábhaíochta, a hill ardbheas a measc locht rachmas hasanna, agus a caiiliú deire is beobacht in níor na héireann.
You've got to remember, a lot of boxers are from a basically disadvantaged background. Tom, probably more so than any other boxer I know, he was a slave. And boxing offers you that escape route, and it really offered him an escape route, and it offered him his life.
Bhí antionachar go dó aige chuirsaí dornálaíochta sna stáitianta agus sa bhreatain, agus bhris sé roinnt rialacha a bhí an nó tradiisiún chuir sé iontas a dán chuoine ag an am sin agus tá sé a dhéanana go fóil.
Scalann scéal Tom Molineaux solas hinéigean staid bhfuil dearmad gláin déanta é. An bhainte bhí ag éideanna le trádal na sclábhaithe, idir locht plándala, cheanníthe agus feiminí réaltais. I siúd a bhuna an gréasán a bhfuil animar lethir, an tatlantach dómh. Tá scéal Tom Molineaux fitte fuaite le ráithná a bhí lárnach I gcultúr hasanna san 8ú haois déag, cuasaí sport agus trádal na sclábhaithe. 3,000 míle óna cheann scríbe a réalaí Gaillimhach a cuidiú tús lena scéal, I ggólínacht a Virginia. Príomhionad damhanda an tionscail tabac a bhí a Virginia nóir sin. Bhí anrathair mar thunscail ach bhí sé brath go mór obair sclábhaithe.
Bhí Virginia bunathe airgid. Bhí Virginia bunathe ón tús mar chomhlacht a bhí thóir airgid a héithrú. Agus dá bhrí sin nuair a tháinig siad an tabac, nuair a thuig siad go raibh an ither I Virginia thar a bheith sásúil le tabac bhí leo. Agus ón tús bhí na tailte a bar le haig tabac a héithrú sa Tidewater, agus bhí sé go húntaach do Virginia go bhéad a díostéis sin dhéanamh mar bhí fuatha brabach a dhéanamh.
It's the crop that really makes the company successful. It makes Virginia very wealthy, but it's a harsh crop to grow. It takes a lot of manpower, and the crop of tobacco really leads directly into the reason that we do have so much slave labor in colony of Virginia at that time.
Planters wanted the work done. They wanted the land cultivated, the tobacco put in, the worms taken off. They wanted to harvest it and get their product to a ship as fast as possible to take it to England to be sold. That's what they were interested in. Some scholars say the origins of slavery would be 1640, some others 1660, but it doesn't appear to have been made or put into a law until about 1700. And that's when you begin to see laws saying that this person can be a slave for life.
Muintir Molineaux na húnéirí a bhí ag Tom. Bhí siad a measc an drama dúchtaí céad hailí Virginia orthu. Buicmhóra a bhí ina sinnte rompu a Sasanna, daoine a runnan rí Charles tailte orthu sa ggólíneacht nó. Anis agus mar a tréan sclábhaithe an idir in Eorop agus an Tileán Uair, bhí rathair cheannithe gá thaobh an Atlantic. Agus bhí baintigh éideanna leis an nó. America bhí éideanna a forbairt na blandálachaí agus chuir an trádal go hindíireach le hincum Calafort Vega nós na Gaillimhe.
Bhí fearmhór go trabhain na Gaillimhe páirteach san tráid sin is sclábhaí. Mar go raibh plandaithe acha héin ins na hindacha hir. Fearhór acu bhí a plandaí hain acu, a plandaí hain acu, ach fearhór eile bhí part ownership acu I blandaithe mar sin. Agus bhí tráid idir na culnachtaí. Harbh táhacht do cuasaí economiacht na Gaillimhe, mar bhí an tráid sin an láidir, bhí an éileh ar siúcra mar hampla. So, do bhhar gur ceannaí iad ó tús, bhí siad ag géirí cuineáil rá leis an tráid sin, agus ba cuma sa deabhlóh le fíorne rá faoi na daoine a bhí páirteach an. Ba chuma an rá siad de gorim nó rá siad bán, ba chuma sa deabhl, adas a bhí siad a déanana brabas ón tráid, bhí siad brasásta le sin.
Heastaí airís na cólíneachtaí nach ra fáilir ó háil a heastaí locht aibre chumá leis an níl anúair a thógáil. Mar is déir ó Reiligi Virginia bhí idir airí agus aibrithe I tíocht ó éireann. Ba harabhantaí faoi cheangal conarí éagóireacha go leor go locht aibre.
It was so expensive for the indentured servants to actually make their way to the country, which is how the vast majority of them became indentured in the first place, is in order to pay passage. Somebody would sponsor the passage to the New World, and that would have to be worked off. In the 17th century, at least the colony of Virginia had many more indentured servants than it did slave labor at that point. That would change pretty quickly.
Uaireanta tuis go raibh na plandálathe, cóthir na plandálathe tabhac, beag go leor, d'oibrigh na searbhóntaí dintúir agus na sclávathe le chéile, agus dábhrí sin dá bhéag fiortha ní cheappa go raibh na canéalacha ró dheifriúil don na searbhóntaí ná mar a bhí ag na sclávathe. Ach ar nói bhí anna dheifriocht atartha, mar ar nói bhí an sclávíocht de Virginia buan, bhí an bíirse buan ó séideag dahad ar aig. Le haig na seirbhísí dintúir, bhí tréimhse seirbhís le déanamh acu, ach tar éis an seirbhís sin a bheith déanta, bhí idir séir, ghlacadh leo mar ghaoine. I Virginia, ghlacadh leis na sclávathe mar bhuain agus ní a bhain san, ach gach éon páiste a rugadh do sclávaí, ba sclávaí an páiste sin comá.
Nuair a d'éiríonn na cólínithe amach in a réal na Breataine sa réabhlóid Vericánach, thug go leor go na plandálathe a gcuid sclávaithe thonna thugaí leo. Duine go na sclávaithe sin a bhí a Zachary, aithir Tom Molineaux. An téan bhlóide óla se tugann faoi is ó thuairis nuachtáin a hagann se. Darnálaigh gan sárú a bhí anna deirtar agus léoch cogaí a chreid sa réabhlóid. Bhain Merica a hiirseamach sa goga sin, ach má bhain is ar chábán suúrach ar Estát a únéire I Jill Zachary Molineaux héis na trodaíochta. Agus is sa gábán sin ar Flandal Tabhac a Virginia a rugú Tom ar an tríú fichid go bhharrta 1884. Ach an éidir den na aithir, thug sé an sline Molineaux ó na únéir.
From bondage to the baddest man on the planet, that's basically what it was. Tom was born on the plantation. He had several brothers, and his father had served in the Revolution and was the guy responsible for showing him how to fight. Tom Molineaux became very tight with the owner of the plantation, Algernon Molineaux, and was kind of like his right-hand man.
Here again, there are all kinds of books which have been written to try to measure why slaveholders were nice people, because they would not, they fed their people, they put their people in clothing and all this kind of thing. You would get a shirt that would be made out of flax, and later on you might get as you get older, you would get some trousers and that kind of thing. But it was the minimum. If a slaveholder could get $100 out of what you did a year, 25 would be spent on you. But that's a year. That's food, clothing, medicine, and everything else. And the slaveholder had the other 75. So that's about how it would work. And there would be some people who took more of a percentage than that. Some places, if they were big enough, had daycares where some of the older women would take care of the younger children until they got to be 3 or 4 years old, and then they would be taken out to the field and probably assigned the job of worming or something like that, but you would call it a half hand.
Agus é beg, deire Tom cordú le maca únéire Algernon, ach má deire níor hábáil se sinné ó bheitthe gobar ó bhaidzin go faoithins na páirceannaí faoin am go raibh hen líon díos.
What does treating a slave well mean when a person is devoid of their own agency, when they are not allowed to make their own decisions, when they don't have a choice of whether or not their children are going to be ripped away from them and sold to another location? So being treated well it's kind of baffling that one would even kind of ask that.
Everybody worked hard during the institution of slavery. No one had machines and things. So if you were a small white farmer, you worked hard. You worked hard. Only difference is what you were working for was yours. You got it, but these people didn't get it. So that's basically different because it was hard work all around. Putting in 50 acres of tobacco and keeping it wormed, and then you got to pull it and you got to cure it and you got to prize it and all these kinds of things. It's not easy. It is not easy. And if you have a bad year, money's tight and your rations are going to be tight. So some people were more violent than others, but that might have just been the person. There are people who are more violent in systems and take advantage of people more than others. But I'm reluctant to say that they were kind masters. I'm more inclined to say that they were benevolent.
Bhí nósannaí agus síl sócúil na Eorpa tucaí leo chun an Oileán Úd ag úinéirí na sclábhaithe. Bhí neart airgid le caitheamh acu agus tháinig rach áir éireann híal na síomsaíochta.
Osí gan dúrnálaíocht más mála garamúla thuirtear is an hochtú iste agus sasna dar irid. Ba hí na daoine bhí leis tíirde ná na daoine úsle agus na mion úsle agus daoine a bhí severe sa lucht an rachmuis. Mar bhí an tairgid a cosisiúd agus bhí an támacha agus bhí an spéisiúcha in san sin sport, mar go raibh omíocht a gceist agus go háirithe go raibh airgid a gceist. Dit is geala chuirsíos mar bhí an tairgid a co agus dá bhrí sin bhí sé anna cosúil ar bhealach le rásaíocht capal, mar bhí go leordas na daoine úsle páirte in san sport áirithe siúd agus capla acu féin, agus go minic thugtaí stáblaí dornálathe ar an grúpa dornálathe a bhíoch faoi canas nó fostathe ag na daoine úsle áirithe seo, sus go dtí an leibhéal riaga. Ba éon fórsa ba láidre mar gheall ar scape a bhíon an scape ar fud an domhain ná impireacht na Breataine. Mar bhí an dúrnálaíocht lárnach in sa gcultúr áirithe sin, agus dá bhrí sin ba chríd na saidúirí agus na marnéalaigh a scapach go leor dus na cluichí sasnach mas má le sin thuirtortha cé gur go leoracha an sean péiscéalaí in cultúr éagsúla. Ba tríd an impireacht a duine gé leathnú go dtí an Ind, go dtí an Africa, go dtí go America.
It's absolutely an import from England, but interestingly enough, nobody really gave a toss about it initially because there was no link, no emotional link. And it was seen as something the English did. So people got involved in prize fights for the usual macho reasons. And they were mostly connected with saloons or with dock enforcers on the docks in New York City, immigrant enforcers, political enforcers, but they didn't get a lot of publicity.
Insna fermacha a bhí America in raibh na slábhathe ag obair, níl mór an tagartí de dúrnálaíocht ach tá samplaí ann chuir magás uaireanta bhíoh tridaní nó umrascáil idir slávaí a bhíoh anna láidir agus cáilúd go má agus slávaí ó ceantas na fermacha eile suas le chéile fechant ar cén duine a bhuach agus sé an tora bheith airna an duine a bhuach thuadach sé sin an duine a cail leis ar ais go dtí ann ar féin.
The myth is, and of course it's in William Faulkner, The myth is that the slave owners matched their slaves in bouts and bet on the bouts, and that these were no-holds-barred bouts. And that's probably true. Now, were any of these slaves actually seriously trained as boxers? Did they really understand the science of boxing? One doubts.
Is begadtá rólas go cínte faoi óige Tom Molineaux, a tá seanachas go leor an faoi. Scéal amháin ná gur ón úinear sclábhithe bacháiliúla ar fad a dólam Tom an darnálaíocht, bin George Washington. Deirte gur a céad uachtar an Mheiriceá ina hampín darnálaíochta ar Virginia trá. Déiteite bheith fíor gur chas Washington agus é amachs na blianta le Molineaux agus é sin óg ag deireadh hístéag. Ach is ag cóisiir sa mbliain 800 sa hain a tugadh suntas de Tom Molineaux den chéad uair.
The great story is that Molineaux fought for his freedom, and that he fought for his freedom because a rival slave owner to his own plantation owner wanted to bet his slave against Molineaux. And Molineaux agreed to do it only if he would get his freedom, and I think it was $400 or something like that, which is a huge amount of money. We're talking about buying, you could have bought the equivalent of a car with that then. You know, slaves were, I don't know, what were they, 800? So, you know, we're talking about getting half his own worth. When this, it's kind of hard to imagine a slave owner actually making that deal unless he was desperate to, it's possible. Anyway, that's the story.
Deisíntacha bhí an de Tom, ach mar sin hain, bhí an leisce towards faoin treid.
The thing that amazed me about that was he said no. You know, he turned it down. He was a docile guy, you know, despite his physique. He said no. They started sweetening the pot a little and offered his freedom, which, I mean, at that time, how do you know you're gonna get your freedom? You were treated as an animal, you know? So maybe it was, in his mind, it was BS. But when they started tossing money around, then really he had no choice.
Agus an tistát, a hirsche, agus na $100 ar gáithán na meo. Thug Tom Molineaux sciúrseáil bhí rócracht a chéile córaigh. Mar luch sihir, díca únéir an tairige de gealú hó. Ní ra Tom ina scláwaí ní bhó.
It didn't mean you were free. It simply meant you did not belong to somebody, because you had no protections from the law at all whatsoever. In fact, Virginia had so many free blacks that in 1806 they passed a law saying that if you became free, you had 1 year to get out of the state and go somewhere else. Yeah.
Thug Tom an bóthar a thuaigh go nuamhrach ar hain. Níor bhardúis cisteanna troda sin a bhád. Anis agus é beo bocht, began nó líoisteach an athúir ar a darnálaíocht, é a treid hartar bhailte Califorts nuamhrach agus New Jersey. Bhí slí bhaithe le baint san áit ag fear a bhí an dúchlan na moch tufailte a hagach isteachar na báid a chóirt.
What boxing there was in the United States at the turn of the 19th century would have been in New York. That's really the only place where it was. As I said, it wasn't a giant big deal, but probably he was a costermonger, or he was a porter, or he was in some way working on the docks, and he probably got involved in boxing then.
Molineaux had a few fights there, you say, but again, these wouldn't even be reported in the newspapers, so boxing was very much low key. But word got to him that England is the place to go. If you want to earn fame and earn the money, the big money, that's the place to go. And that's how he set off on his great adventure.
Bhí Tom héis sláirí a sclábaí a Hawaii, ach má bhí, ba jaar go bhfuair sé amach nar a bheith neamhar talla bheith síl na saoirse. Fostaíomh Molineaux mar chúntar longa ar bord an Bristol agus í gimocht don nuamhrach go learfol. Trí bhí a thógad sé an Atlantach a thrasnú sa mbliain 1809. Bheadh sé deacair bealach níos achrannaí a hallú le 18 go chathamh.
Diganá tuisgur chosnig sé annachchuid airge daine úmper ó áit a bhain go áit eile, níor chur na cólachtaí golóir bia bord, agus dábhrí sin ní raibh diganá ach bí golóir bia de leat an tros. Bhí sé trúlathe, bhí sé lofa faoi dhearra an tros, bhí an isce dubh lán le péisteanna, bhí an ship biscuit, bhí sé sin lán le fehadí. Agus níomhhain san ach bhí annachchuid daoine garda chéile, mar sin bhí na galar antógálaach ar fad, go fiú mílta, léim siad ó rinne go duine, bhí scarbachán, bhí dineracht ina measc, agus ar nói bhí fiomhras orthú, agus lean sé sin ó rinne go duine, agus dá bhrí sin bhí sé anna bhíchláin túil ar na linge sin.
Agus lenda tugus slán sábailte ar halamh tírim me learfol, chuir Molineaux héine láthir mar hampín Verica. Ní ra bonu sa bileis mar hedal. An uair sin banan champín hasanna agus champín na crinne, agus bhí an choirí sin an hana héin. Tom Crib.
Bhí Molineaux féin anna bhuiníachas féin. Níor bhéin cúchaléir, agus dá bhrí sin dréir a céile, it's a céit bhlíonn thosaigh sé an dornálaíocht go gardamúil mas maiad in ochta agus a de bhí trí ridige. Bhuaigh sé an céad ceann a gcuine fearr ran an boroughs as Bristol, láráit na dornálaíocht a freisin in Bristol. An sin bhuaigh sé ar fearr ran Tom Blake nó Tom Tuff, agus an sin an tríú ceann cúis sé isteach a gcuine chorann na Bretainne, Tom Crib. Agus bhí an tríd sin sucrathe I 1990 ochta agus a de.
Yes, it was against America, but they certainly didn't want an American, let alone a black American, to come over here. And that was an underlying issue that they didn't want to say, but they didn't want it. And I think that made it even more of a mystery for England and why it got so much attention. You know, not only was this American coming over, he was a black guy.
Is saoire sin na bliana 810, bhí tír agus talla a súl go mór leis a treidir champín hasanna agus an fearr gorama thug gúchláin. Agus é a réiteacht an cha, thuí Molineaux a gcóirle le hirscláí agus champín eile, an dairnálaí Bill Richmond.
Mar a hála nó a bhúil sé isteach go sasna bhí an tá leis, mar casag fearr ban an Bill Richmond agus duine an cliste bhí ann duine an chuna gorm freisin ach go dairí go hana bhaith leis I sasna. Mar tugadh go sasna bhí sin na Harabhánta ag duine dus na mionúsle agus ifig go garma bhí ann freisin. Thug sé sin go Londonúir bhí sé óg, dá bhrí sin bhí sé ábalta dul daithí ar cultúr na núsle agus cultúr hasanna, agus dá bhrí sin bhí sé ábalta cabhrú le Tom Molineaux.
He had gone and seeked out other people to manage him. And they were like, no, you need to go to your own kind, and which virtually got him to Bill Richmond. Bill Richmond, he saw the interest from everyone, and he saw a money-making thing. If he really cared about Tom Molineaux and his race, because let's face it, I mean, that was the connection, he would have stepped in and steered this guy in the right direction. Instead, he let him party and do what he had to do, and he wasn't focused on training.
The truth of the matter is he probably hadn't really trained. I mean, he was a bit of a drunk, apparently. And it didn't help that his manager / trainer owned a bar. so he might have, you know, I think really the strategy for beating Molineaux was to just stay out there with him as long as you could, because the guy was really tough and really strong. And he had a heck of a trainer, you know. So, you know, just outlast him.
Bhí treid Tom Molineaux in áid Tom Crib ar an nachtaláide go nólaigh 810, ar cheann go bhhabhtaí móra na tréimhse sin roimh ré na mitóg. Breis agus céad bliana na dhiaidh sin, rinneadh scunán a bhí bunaí ar a gcóireach dar teidil When Giants Fought. Be bheag athrú bhí teacaí ar chúrsaí cóin in is cinenne idir an dá líon. Darnálaí meanmhach an dar a bhenim Frank Craig a ghlachpáirt Molineaux, fearr ar lú an teidil choirí gorm na cruinne ar trá.
Well, Tom Cribb was revered by the populace at large as a great figure in English life, and everybody knew him. He was a personality. He was what we call now a celebrity.
Tríocha míle tíomh má go London a reachtála bhain treid. Le tíomh an áine troda bhí Pierce Egan, idir seoir darnálaíochta mór le rá. Dar le siúd, bhí an treidir i gceanna beár agus a builtí dar facas riamh Hallow Hasanna.
Pierce Egan had been ringside for all of the big fights in that day. He wrote that it was the most brutal fight he had ever witnessed. Just in the back of your mind, if you could imagine, a very dark-skinned black man fighting a very white man, and at some point not being able to tell the two apart because of, bruises and discoloration from blood and everything else is to me it's mind-boggling, really.
Cá fuilteach fíochhuir a bhís na chéad naomh déag, ach deide le Molineaux an fód a hasa más a réigen héine. Is an sinna hitteach an méide dag smáil háil na Sasanach mar ghráma déalaíoch ceart agus cóir a gúrsaí sport. Achtra thugann tuairiscóir Pierce Egan an feall ba bhór náir riamh i síl sports na Breataine.
Ba hé an rud ba bhó ar caint faoin tríd sin in níomh sin ná an camaléirta bhí a gceistin sin. Mar dúirt go leor na daoine a bhí a láthair agus go háirithe na hiiriseoirí a scríofainn i dhéag go raibh camaléirta a gceist, agus go mar cóir go muach Tom Molineaux an tríd sin. Agus tá go leor samplaí den rud a hálas a tríd sin le fáilins na pápéirí nuachta. Gur tugadh buntáiste speisialta de Tom Cribb le ling na truda. Nuair ba córdó a bheith dícáilethe tuis gur thug sé bhhad níos mó ama nar mar a bhíonn na rialacha teachta rééis ceann dus na boutaí sin.
England did not want a black American to win that title. At least 3 times that fight should have been over. And, at one point he had Cribb in a headlock and he was literally locked. The rules back then, a fighter had to hit the ground before they would end the round. And he was unconscious. And because he was locked in Molineaux's grip, he couldn't fall to the canvas or to the ground at this point. And the crowd actually rushed the ring and broke his fingers to separate him. Then they drag him back to his corner and give him more than the 30 seconds to come to.
Anybody who's there has money on the fight. Everybody. Why do you go to a prize fight in those days? To bet, right? I mean, that's why you're there. And of course, anybody who's there who has bet on the fight is rabidly partisan. And if there's any way to save the money you've bet, you will. And if it involves cutting the ropes and rushing the ring, you'd do it, wouldn't you?
Bhí camaléirta siúil freisin mar gur briseadh cuid bhd an cró nuair a bhí Tom Cribb i gcontúirt ná Máil, agus in Nearnadála bhí sé bunithe cuid mhór ar an rud a rinne duine bhí a cabhrail de Tom Cribb sa cúine, Joe Ward, gur tháinig sé trasna agus chuirsaí é le Tom Cribb gur raibh rudaí ina lábhaige, gur raibh rudaí mitil ina lábhaige, agus bhí isige nach raibh, ach bhí sé géirí am áil go bhhétar Tom Cribb teachta níor as an triblód an raibh sé an babhta sin. Agus in dhé sin bhí Tom Molineaux có tréachta go méid an dó éirí as. Agus déir an duine na finéthe a bhí a láthair gur camaléir ceart a bhíonn sin agus ba cóir go méid an choróin ag Tom Molineaux ach níhé sin mar a hála.
When you're a boxer and you've been training for so long and you've dedicated your life to the sport and to achieving a dream of becoming a world champion, and for that opportunity to be grabbed and taken away from you by an unjust decision, by people sitting around the ring who cheated, that's something that you have to be able to live with and you have to be able to move on. Unfortunately, Tom, there was no really coming back from that, and it must be harrowing to deal with. It must really just play in your mind.
Fortunately for Tom Molineaux, most of the people did recognize that he was robbed. And as a matter of fact, Tom Cribb, it was actually fuel for him to prove that he could beat Molineaux, and that's what started the discussions of a rematch.
Má bhí Tom Cribb fós in a hampaín hasanna is Tom Molineaux a bhí an saoil sa bháthar a caint. Lí Cribb isteach le díocas a tréinál le réiteach go nachchórach. A bhallart sa rinne Molineaux is an ól I rí sesin.
Ón am gur chréchnig an tríd sin, go dtí an Tom ar raibh tríd eile acu le chéile. Bhí an time ag Tom, bhí sé taistil timpeall na tíre a déanana taspántas agus gnóigh sé anna go airgid. Ach ba héan míomhantáiste bhain le sin, mar ní raibh sé a tréanáil I gceart don tarna tríd. Bhí sé tucha don ragarne agus don ól agus na maná, agus dábhrí sin nuair a tháinig an tarna tríd timpeall, ní raibh sé réig I gceart dó.
In Tom Cribb's mind, he took Molineaux lightly in the first fight, which made that fight go on as long and as brutal as it did. As we find in the second fight, Tom Cribb came back, trained much better, and conversely, Tom Molineaux didn't. And that goes back to what we were talking about before with Bill Richmond. He did not force Molineaux to train. He basically let him do what he wanted. He never really fine-tuned his boxing skill, if we're going boxing of the day. He had his hammer blow, which was just a powerful downward motion, which most men couldn't contend with. And again, Bill Richmond didn't really teach him anything else. He was basically had that attitude of, hey, if you're not going to listen to me, do what you want. If you know better than me, go ahead, do what you want. And he did.
San éanú bháta déag, dá Cribb a chéile córic sínte gan aithne gan orlaura. Rinne an sasanna daunsa ceilúthe timpeall ar Molineaux é a duine funóide faoi os córa tlua.
This time, Tom Cribb won that fight hands down. Molineaux was never the same fighter after the first fight. He didn't put into it, and he was more of a novelty.
That was one of the ways he could cash in on his fame by appearing boxing exhibitions, for instance, with other prominent English pugilists, and getting paid for that. For spectators would have to pay to watch him, or to teach the art of boxing. I mean, he could set himself up as obviously one of the main contenders for the championship of the world, as such as it was. His tuition would be considered very valuable, I'm sure. Quite well-to-do people would gladly pay up big money to have him tutor them.
Chunne Molineaux éad a darnálaíocht, ach ní ratáda éasca faoin gosán achrannach a bhí ránaí go héin. I nniumacht coppla bliain gear, bhí spirid misnú le néire thug dúchláin Tom Cribb briste bascaí. Nuair a hirsise loch darnálaíocht a hasanna rá, thugra Molineaux go gaithte tusa an áthúir as an nó in áit nach ra aithne na ólas éad. Wardal Molineaux bád a bhí a seoladh go bla clia. Bhí a héal ina chéar thuthal ach bhí leitheantí níos deacra fós roimhe in éireann.
He turned to Ireland and he teamed up with George Cooper, a prominent English pugilist, to come over to Ireland and teach, again, show himself in exhibitions and teaching the art of boxing.
Ach ba chuma cáirleag Tom a chuis, bhí néal dómh na slábhaíochta bagart a gcónaí. Bhí sé a bhád anis an eastát ar tháinig sé a Saoilán, ach má bhí hain fiú in éireann ba dheacair éalú go thomláin ó chúlra éagórach a óige.
Cuir éire agus cuir go háirithe ceannaithe I limnach agus ceannaithe I gcorcaig, ceannaithe as Gaillimh, chuir siad lastas de stóras chuig Barbados agus chuig na Heileáin sin. Mar go raibh Barbados a go háirithe bunaithe ar burbach a dhéanamh as siúcra agus mar sin héirigh siad siúcra. Níor héirigh siad éon rud eile. Dá bhrí sin bhí stóras ag teastáil uatha. So chuirc na stóras an stóras sin ar na linge éarnacha sao go Barbados. Fiúg siad suas siúcra. Chuig siad ar aig leis an siúcra go Virginia. Fiúg siad suas tabac an san agus bhalartaigh siad cuid an siúcra don tabac. Agus an sin cheol siad arás, agus de bhí tóir ar an rud a fuair siad. Dá bhrí sin bhí annachchuid airgid le déanamh as an gréasán trádála a bhí bunathe ar an sclavíocht.
Más go mála dás an darnálaíocht mar sport America, bhí an tóirigh muinte na héireanna. Nuair a landal Tom Molineaux am le clia, tháinig sé go raibh neart trodaithe món Aibreán agus neart pátrún haimhre a taco leo. Ba ghearr go raibh loch leanúna an sport a caintear a trodaí nua in a measc.
What Molineaux was doing was he was at the end of his rope at that point. You know, his value had gone down in England. He decided to do what they used to do, go into local communities and towns and fight the toughest guys and, you know, bring people in or whatever. And that's where he found himself in Ireland. Ireland was very receptive. They wanted to see him. They were paying to see Molineaux. That's why he went there.
Far gorm a bhí. So chuir na daoine ansim go deo ina eiceáil agus más a tréid nó fiú eiceáil héin. Agus is ine an chuí gur éirigh leis leannacht a ráin. Deirhin gur rinne sé gur óil sé an chuid is mó gan airgid a rinne sé.
When they came to Ireland, he sought out the best boxer in Ireland and everybody pointed towards the Irish champion Dan Donnelly. So himself and Cooper sought out Donnelly at his carpentry shop in Dublin and arranged a meeting. And immediately Molineaux issued a challenge. He says, I'd like to fight you to an actual prize fight.
Iúltaí Donnelly de Rúthlan Molineaux, a rá nach dreitite in ai firhí cuite, nó in ai fear gorum. Le tiile oidce chuir Molineaux, ghlach Donnelly le cuire chun troda in ai George Cooper, partner Molineaux mar sporán mór airgid.
Yeah, he was very irate by accounts at Donnelly's court dismissal of his challenge and accused him of racial prejudice and cowardice, if you like. But Donnelly was adamant that, you know, Cooper was the man he wanted to fight. And he felt that this would progress his career better than beating a man who most people said and knew that it was well past his best.
Bhí an córaach sin a chreid Dan Donnelly in ai George Cooper a sputtar seo ar chorach Hildara i mína saona 85. Cheanna gona bouty troda ba bhó sporáin agus ba bhó cáil a agriíomh riamhanéireann a nuas go dtí an lá sin. Agus héin caite go leataíomh thug Tom faoi chamcuairt timpeall na héireann. A chur troda ar chuile mhac máthir a thug go Rúthláin is sráidhailte agus ag crosmhóirí na tíre.
Bhí Molineaux inis ag deire a héal ó híomh dornálaíochtaí bhí sé spíonta caithfar ará. So bhí sé ag gol timpeall na láithreachaí seo, na héanaigh seo, na margaigh seo a déanamh tríd taspántaí agriíoch sé. Agus thugad duine áitiúil na aig agus curfií gealan an seo nó an siúd agus béidir gomach simbeag airigh agus is ar a gcuí sin a deirí leis a héana bhaint sláán ar feadh go dtí deire a héal. Bhí sé héin bochtanis ní roion airgid aige agus ba mhór an trúé agus ní hamháin sin ach bhí sé tin agus bhí sé agóil i lige agus sé an alcohol an fíomhras ba mhó a bhí aige agus ní ana sé sin rud ar bith chun é an neartú ó híomh dornálaíochtaí.
He was able to continue making enough to get by, to feed himself. But his health was deteriorating at that point rapidly. And soon after the Cooper-Donnelly fiasco, I will call it, it wasn't long after that where he wasn't able to fight anymore.
Is saoire na bliana 80 Juan Molineaux baile na Gaillimh amach. Bhí a leichantí orga a bhádar a chúl faoin trá seo, a fós héin bhí coppla pín le tuileamh a mhaile a radúla daoine an I ngach cinál sport fola.
Cuidir gan na siamsaí seo tharla siad ar an dónach. Is cosúil nach rá aon dlí a baint leis na rudaí seo ar an dónach. Bhí ag anna chuid siamsaí, bhí ag standing ní daoine a díl stuff agus a lehéad. Ach, bhí siamsaí eile cosúil le béidir céapa brochanna nó treideanna idir chuilíg agus rudaí an tóirtín agus fiú dornálaíochta le dorn nochtathe agus is an seo a rinne Molineaux cuidir gona trodanna deirí istócha ina héin.
Faoin trá seo, bhí Tom a strathas leis an etin is é beobacht. Is an sin ar tháid gáilehach a tháinig casa beag chun fés ar a scéal.
An am tháinig Molineaux go gaiileh ar bhealach mór a bhí an tá leis, mar an ceangas na regiment a bhí lonithe in gáileh ag an am ná an 67, the 77th Regiment of Foot mar an létar ortha. Bhí siad san lonithe in gáileh ag an am. Agus bhí banna cheol le beag na chuile regiment a bhí an, ceangas na rudaí bhór a thóg siad go gaiileh ná an cheol agus an na bannaí cheol sin. Agus mar bháil an banna cheol a bhí ag an 67 ná trúr fér ghorim. Éar sclávaí a bhí anta, daoine a bhí rééis bheith mar sclávaí ach d'éirigh siad as a sclávaíocht dá bhhar go rá siad an am golisteach san airm, mar cheoltóirí. So castar ar a chéile iad, agus le férinne rá, bhí siad an chanáalta rá, bhí stóras acha nó cófra beag de haid na thualaisí ar fad. Agus bhí an cófra sin cumáta teas, tírim, agus thug siad seans de Molineaux golisteach an, fannacht an, thug siad leaba go an. Agus nuair a d'éirigh si níos measa nó níos measa a chuid chláinte ag gairí níos measa réir a chéile. Bhí siad an canálta go, agus thug siad ara go rud nach nearna duine bé ó riamh.
Ach an éard na dála, ní raibh sí ábhailte téarnamh agus fuair sé bás I mí lúnasa 8 agus a 8. Agus bin deirle le Tom.
Fuair sé bás, de bhhair an galar a bhí aige, go raibh sé chomh sin, go raibh sé spianta go thomláin. Agus bhí ceist ó thaobh ó mach éilecha aige a gcuirtear in éilecha ceart. Agus bhí éilecha ceart aige, chuir siad isteach in san rélig a Merviú, agus at go leor bhí sé tíomh le muintir linsigh, an Clangas na Cillian is mó na Severasí is tábhachtaí ngáileamh.
Beag nach 100 bliain héis go heidir champaign na cruinne a bheith sciupaí go Tom Molineaux, bhain darnálaí gorum an teidir sin. Bhí deire inis leis a sclábhaíocht ach go bhfar gur Americá Jim Crow a d'éirí champaign nua tromhechanna an domhan Jack Johnson a níos, bhí sé fós ina híreannach go darna grád. Scanraí bua Johnson chuid go hanúndúirí an chinna ghill, tríálú an tír hampín Jim Jeffries a bheile isteach sa bháine troda a ríist, le go meach fearr geall ina hampín in athúir. Bhí Jeffries buailte go donna. Chuir Johnson tús le ré nó a ra an darnálaí gorum a réim an America, ach maidir leis an bhear a chur tús leis ar fad, bhí sé anan is dearmata.
In today's world, boxing and boxers, much like myself, are from areas where you're looking to improve, you're looking to step up, you're looking to keep going forward. And boxing for me offered me that way forward, and I had an ability for it and I loved it. And I'm one of the lucky few who have come out the good side of it. I know many boxers and a huge percentage of boxers don't.
Traditionally, boxing has had many, many robberies that changed the course of history. But if Tom Molineaux won that fight, if that fight was ended the way it should have, and he was crowned the world champion, I think a lot of things would have changed. I mean, I think racial tension wouldn't have been as bad as it was. The whole 100 years later with Jack Johnson wouldn't have been as, Jim Crow America as it was. I mean, the world would have changed.
Feadh ghaithe bliain beagnach, lí céad léach sport Verica in ui anathnid a relic héimus naofa a gcathair na Gaillimhe. An téan áitir a chur síos ar fáil ar a eistir coracha Istad Tobacco Virginia go chathair na dreamh ná is sean leabhar buí ar nálaíochta. Contas a bhí plóchta iad hain in neannach na dtí chuimhne.
Tom Molineaux hen tháinig an leabhar seo thugann pugilistica. Tá sé bhuirim 3 iris leabhar fáilte go sa bhliain 1905 agus sé tá an ná stair na dornálaíochta sa bhreatain san 1910. Sa chomhaib sin tá betheasnéis Tom Molineaux an cumá leis na daoine eile agus tá sé táchtach dúine go bhfuil cuid sholas an faoi a léhananta deire I gcathair na Gaillimhe. From Scotland, Molineaux went on a sparring tour into Ireland. And at the latter end of the year 1817, he was travelling over the northern parts of that country, teaching the stick-fighting natives the use of their fists. Molineaux was illiterate and ostentatious, but good-tempered, liberal, and generous to a fault. Fond of gay clothes, gay life, and amorous to the extreme, he deluded himself with the idea that his strength of constitution was proof against excesses. Alas, poor Molineaux found out the vanity of his conceited boast and repented, but too late. He was the worst of fools, inasmuch as he sacrificed fame, fortune, and life, excusing himself by the absurd plea that he was a fool to no one but himself.